It's Saturday, November 7th, 2020. Welcome to the Front Porch Report Election Special. I'm Taz.
I'm Sam.
And we are your co-hosts. Today is a very special day because we are going to be covering the results of the election. But there's a twist. You see, Sam has spent the last 5 days in a self-imposed social media friend group exile and hasn't looked at any information about what has been going on as we've been tallying the votes for the election. So, living under his rock, Sam knows nothing, and we're going to have some fun with that.
Yeah, I did have some spoilers, unfortunately. My mother texted me something about Michigan having like 101% of registered voters vote. I don't know if that's true or not. I doubt that that's true for the entirety of the state. Maybe some precincts within the state had that as an issue, but I don't know how credible that is. I had a few other things. My wife about halfway through the week said, well, can I at least tell you which states that we're waiting on? Which told me that we were waiting on multiple states. And I knew some things from beforehand. I knew that Pennsylvania had mentioned that they were accepting ballots regardless of postmark up until the 6th. So that was just yesterday. So from what I understood, though, I was in the dark just as everyone else was because things were still up in the air for quite a while until, from what I understand, were just solidified this morning, for at least from what I've heard from other people.
Yep, it was a touch and go thing for quite a while there, and, kind of the day after election night, I kind of had an idea of who I thought was going to win, and I think most people did, but it really was anyone's race up until, like you said, pretty much this morning.
So do we have a solid answer as of this morning?
This morning, well, obviously nothing's official yet because it's all going to be litigated in the courts and in the states and everything. But as of this morning, we can pretty confidently declare who the winner is.
Okay.
And we'll get to that a little later in the episode for the grand finale. Okay.
So we're going to break this down into 3 kind of major sections. So we're going to talk mostly about the federal elections. So the first section, we're going to talk about the Senate and what the results were there. Next, we'll talk about the House and the results thereof. And then we'll save, of course, the presidency for last.
Before we get into actual results, though, Sam, I think that you've done some research on some of the key institutions of our government so that we can give some context to maybe some of the talking points that people have given about the Senate or the House or these different places. So as we move into the Senate section of our episode, could you tell us a little bit about the Senate?
Yeah, I think it's important here to understand that we have to understand why the framers made our government the way they did, right? And having an understanding of the context and the reasons why they gave us, the great documents such as the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and why that has been passed down and preserved for so long. I think it's important, and you hear, you probably have your friends sharing Vox articles on Facebook or saying like, we need to, get rid of the Senate, or the Senate is, undemocratic, or we need to abolish the Electoral College. And these institutions exist for a reason. So looking at Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, it was originally said the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislator thereof. For 6 years, each senator shall have 1 vote. Okay, right. So originally, the Senate was not selected by the people. It was actually selected by the state legislatures. And the reason why this was is we wanted the Senate to have representation for the states. The smaller states knew that they could be railroaded by the larger states if they didn't get an equal voice in at least one of the chambers.
Why was it important that the states themselves have power? Don't we live in a democracy where the will of the people is what ultimately matters?
I think it's important to understand that the framers never intended for us to be a true democracy. And in fact, America is not a true democracy. Anybody who paid attention in civics class in high school would understand that. We are both a republic and a democracy, right? And so, for instance, if we were to take a vote right now and 51% of the population were to say outlaw free speech, for example, 51% of the population said the government has the right to ban free speech, that would be declared unconstitutional. Even though a majority of the population voted for it, it would not be allowed by our government. So we are not literally in a direct democracy. And so it's important that the states have voice in the matter, because there were a conglomeration of states. The idea that the founders had is that the government most local to you should have the most control over your life. And so we were several states coming together as one sovereign nation, right? The Americans' creed says we are a sovereign nation of many sovereign states, one and inseparable, established upon the principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, right? So we have an important understanding of that, but any of you who have participated in an election recently would say, wait a minute, I vote for my senator. What do you mean that the senators were originally slated to be voted upon by the state legislators? Well, that is thanks to good old Amendment 17, which was ratified in 1913, which then changed it to the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years. So again, as we learned in civics class, every 2 years, approximately 1/3. Of course, 100 is not divisible by 3. So, give or take 1/3 of the Senate's seats are up for re-election each cycle.
Why the number 6? Is it important that the senators each serve for such long terms?
So the reason why that was given is it was supposed to be, quote, a cooling saucer. So Thomas Jefferson had made that reference. He had originally said that it was to be an anchor, a fence, a saucer. He has very different analogies. One that I prefer is James Madison. He says that Senate was to be the great anchor of government. He went on to explain it would be a necessary fence against the fickleness and passion that tended to influence the attitudes of the general public and members of the House of Representatives. George Washington is to have told Jefferson the framers had created the Senate to, quote, cool House legislation just as a saucer was used to cool hot tea. So the House was supposed to be almost as if a referendum every 2 years to continually change. Every seat in the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years, whereas the Senate, again, only 1/3 of them is up for election approximately every 2 years. So it was designed to be this staying force, this fence, this long-term acting as a check and balance, that each of these have separate but equal roles when it comes to our government, with the Senate having to do judiciary hearings, having to do many of the other duties, whereas the House is setting up duties such as investigative efforts, such as the impeachment, amongst other things. And so, not each of the House is not considered more powerful than the other, though you often hear the lower chamber of Senate being referred to as the House and the upper chamber referred to as the Senate. But each of them has their own distinct reasons and importance for why we have them in our government.
So it almost seems like the Senate was designed for a sort of gridlock to occur, to be the thing that stops the other branches of government from doing things in a hasty manner, because if we had branches of government that were constantly causing things to happen and being prime movers in the government, then a slight majority might work to take away the liberties of a minority. And what the framers were really frightened of was this idea of mob rule, where 51% can dictate to the rest of the world or the rest of the country exactly what is to happen, and the Senate kind of stands against that by being representative of the states rather than the people, and of having these 6-year terms rather than 2-year terms.
Exactly, and that is what the original framers intended. So it's an important establishment. I'm interested to see what is going on. Going into the 2020 election, Republicans had 54 seats.
53.
53 seats, my apologies. 53 seats in the Senate. And the Democrats, including 2 independents, I believe, registered, had the remaining seats. So I'm interested to see how that has shifted. And I have highlighted some key races that we will overall talk about in a moment. But first, the first question I have on the docket is, do we even know, I imagine, just as there were some holdout states in the Electoral College, I imagine Georgia. I did see a blurb come across that Georgia was calling a recount, considering Georgia had 2 senators up for election, which is rarity. I'd be interested to see what happens there. But do we even have a solid count of who has control of the Senate?
Well, Sam, I've got some good news and bad news for you. The good news is that the vast majority of Senate races have had enough results that they can be confidently called. Unfortunately, and I'm just going to read you the numbers as they stand right now, Democrats have 48. They have added 1. Republicans have 48. They have lost 1. So at this moment, it is unclear who will hold the Senate when this is all said and done. However, Democrats coming in, if you'll remember, had to gain 4 seats in order for them to have a real majority. Technically, they only had to gain 3 because if one side has 50, then if both sides have 50, then the vice president, who is technically the president of the Senate, gets to be the tiebreaker vote. But
So does that 48 for the Democrats include the 2 independents that typically associate with Democratic caucus?
That caucus with them, yes.
Okay. All right, so let's look at the individual elections that we have listed out. And I don't remember the order. You've edited the document, so I don't want to go back and look at it. But you can give my predictions, and we can go from there.
Yes. So, for the Senate races that you were most interested in, first off, in Texas, in the race between John Cornyn and MJ Hagar, you predicted that John Cornyn would retain his seat. Texans have voted, and as the votes now stand, John Cornyn has held his seat.
Okay.
Next, in Montana, in the race between Steve Daines and Steve Bullock.
I guarantee you Steve won.
Correct. You predicted that Steve Daines, the Republican, would win. And the people of Montana have voted. As it now stands, Steve Daines is victorious. Okay. Next, moving on to Kentucky. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell versus his challenger, Amy McGrath. You believed that Mitch McConnell would emerge victorious. People of Kentucky have voted. As it now stands, Mitch McConnell is victorious. South Carolina, Lindsey Graham versus Jamie Harrison. You predicted that Jamie Harrison would be victorious in his challenge against Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. This is actually one of the spoilers that you were telling me about, that you...
My dad had said that a nationwide race, or a race with nationwide implications, didn't go the way he wanted to. The time he told me that was about 8:30 Central Standard Time, so I figured it was something on the East Coast. The only person I can imagine that my dad would care about is Lindsey Graham, just knowing my dad's values. So that is part of the reason I predicted that, but Graham's polling didn't look super great, especially after the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. There was that whole situation with the Judiciary Committee. So I didn't imagine his chances were good, but I could be wrong.
And Lindsey Graham has been the head of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, so he plays a very important role in the Republican Party.
Yes.
Well, as I said before, you predicted that Jamie Harrison would be victorious. People of South Carolina have voted, and Jamie Harrison was unsuccessful in his attempt to unseat Lindsey Graham.
Okay.
Moving on to Iowa, the race between Republican Joni Ernst and Democrat Teresa Greenfield. You predicted that Teresa Greenfield would emerge victorious. The people of Iowa have voted, and Joni Ernst has withheld against Teresa Greenfield. Moving on to Maine, to a very, very interesting, very tight race with one of the most endangered senators on the Republican side of the aisle. In Maine, Susan Collins versus Sarah Gideon. You and the polls predicted that Sarah Gideon would emerge victorious, but the people of Maine voted, and Susan Collins retained her seat.
Really? That is probably one of the biggest shocks I've heard. Wow.
When on Wednesday when I woke up at 4 a.m. for work and going in, but I checked the results as they had come in by that point, and that was one of the top things that I saw, and the most surprising for me because the polls were not good for her, but she has held on to Maine, and even though she's rather moderate and breaks with Republicans on many issues, including recently the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, the fact that she caucuses with the Republicans means that she contributes to their effort to be in the majority, which can make all the difference in certain things. Moving on to Georgia. As we mentioned earlier, Georgia actually had 2 Senate elections going on right now. Their normal one and then a special election to replace the Republican senator who had retired due to health reasons. So you predicted that both of these seats would go blue. In the regular election, people of Georgia voted, and David Perdue, the Republican, received 49.8% of the vote, a plurality. However, in Georgia, in order to become a senator, you have to receive at least 50% of the vote. So that race will go to a runoff. For the special election, Democrat Raphael Warnock received 32.9% of the vote, a plurality, while Kelly Loeffler of the GOP received 25.9% of the vote, and Doug Collins, also a Republican, received 20% of the vote. That race will also go to a runoff.
Assumedly with the top 2
Probably, yes.
candidates going forward. Okay. And from what I understand, another spoiler I had is that Georgia was undergoing a recount, for at least from what I had seen a blurb pop up. And considering these elections were close, and also compounding the fact of 2018, you have the whole situation of Stacey Abrams going on in Georgia. I imagine these races are going to be highly, highly, sought after, and the eyes of the nation are really on Georgia.
Yes, Georgia is one of the states that we've been paying extra special close attention to, and the results of which were Donald Trump needed to win Georgia in order to win, and we shall see whether or not he succeeded.
His path for 270, almost any breakdown you look at it includes Georgia, realistically.
Mm-hmm. And finally for the Senate, and we're not going through every single Senate race, but these are some of the more interesting ones that Sam especially wanted to be able to react to. In Arizona, in the race between fighter pilot Martha McSally and astronaut Mark Kelly, the people of Arizona voted. You predicted that Mark Kelly would win, and you were correct.
Man, was it close?
Mark Kelly got 51.3% of the vote, and Martha McSally got 48.7%.
Okay, so that is pretty close.
Yes.
All right, we are moving on to the House of Representatives. So
yes.
Going into the 2020 election, Democrats had a large majority in the House. I imagine they will retain it. I could be wrong as we move forward, but let's talk a little bit about the House of Representatives. So, something I found out, interesting enough, is, and I discovered this due to a race out in California, which we'll be talking about in a minute. You have Maxine Waters versus Joe Collins, and Joe Collins was doing a lot of social media advertisement for his campaign. And one of the things that he pointed out is that Maxine Waters does not live in her district. He has an ad, I think it was called Mansion Maxine or Millionaire Maxine, I don't remember which. But he was pointing out that she has a $6 million mansion that is not, in fact, in her district. And I was like, is that legal? And sure enough, I looked up in the Constitution, and we have in the Constitution, it says, no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. That is to say that, according to the Constitution, you have to be a resident of the state that you are running for in the House of Representatives, but you do not have to live in the district that you're representing. I was not aware of that until really looking into it, but that's just a fun blurb about the House of Representatives. Again, as we talked about earlier when we were contrasting it with the Senate, all of the members are up for election every 2 years, so it's much more subject to change as compared to the Senate.
All right. Well, we'll start right off with that race in California between Maxine Waters and Joe Collins. And you predicted that Maxine Waters would emerge victorious. People of the California district, 43rd district, I think, have voted, and Maxine Waters emerged victorious.
Joe did have a good social media campaign, I will say that. He was a veteran, seemed like a good guy with a good head on his shoulders. So I'd be interested to see where his career in politics takes him, and I hope that he does decide to run for some other office and pursue. I think he's from what I've seen and researched on him, he seems like a good individual.
Maybe he can run for the House in a different district.
Pretty much.
All right, so moving on, the rest of these House races that we're going to be looking at are in Texas, because that is the state in which we reside, and so these are closest to home, affect us most personally, and so starting out, we're looking at the race between Wesley Hunt and Lizzie Fletcher. You predicted that Wesley Hunt would be victorious, and it is in fact Lizzie Fletcher who emerged in this race. Also in Texas, we have the race between Dan Crenshaw and Seema Lajavardian. In this race, Dan Crenshaw emerged victorious, as you predicted.
Not surprised.
Also in Texas, we have a race a little close to home for you in San Antonio between Mauro Garza and Joaquin Castro. You believed that Castro would retain his seat, and you were correct.
Yep. And that is the district I live in, so that's why I was interested in that race. And then there's another race in San Antonio that I think we're talking about next, and that is just next to me, and that is the Wendy Davis race.
Yes, so Wendy Davis versus Chip Roy. You believed that Wendy Davis would emerge victorious. The people next to you voted, and Chip Roy ended up winning.
Wow, okay.
And so now looking at the big picture, as you said before, the Democrats came into this race with a pretty significant lead in the House. And as it currently stands, we don't have all the results quite in yet, but the Democrats have 214 House seats secured. They need 218 to get the majority. And the Republicans have 195. And the last count that I looked at, it seems like the Republicans have gained 10 to 15 seats in this election cycle.
Okay, so the Republican Party has narrowed that gap, but it likely, at least from the numbers we're looking at now, still end up in a Democrat-controlled House.
Correct.
Which, to be honest with you, I'm coming mostly from a moderate with slight Republican leanings perspective. And so for me, a divided government actually is a good thing, right? So we're going to have some stability. You're not going to get something crazy through without major bipartisan support. We look at, what happened over this past cycle with having the crime reform bill that got passed. That was something that needed to be passed, and it did get passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. And so I think that in some aspects, a divided government is a good thing because it allows, unless it is something that really, really needs to get done, it allows neither party to have, this crazy wish list that they can just check off and go, take it either direction. It allows, checks and balances to take place.
Yep, and both sides have to move in the direction of the larger number of people, which, anyone probably finds themselves leaning to one side or the other of a spectrum. And if they're leaning towards those who are further to the right of them, if they're a Republican, or further to the left of them, if they're a liberal, then that means that they are appealing to a minority rather than appealing to a majority. And when you have a divided government, then you have to reach across the aisle to a certain degree. And what it results is ultimately the things that do get passed are things that have that overwhelming support, like that criminal justice reform bill that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. So now we are moving on to the biggest race that was on the 2020 ballot. As some have called it, it was the referendum on Trump. Right? And we have nationwide polls that were taking place, and there was polling data nationwide that was indicating that Joe Biden would win. But I want to point out that nationwide polling is not very helpful, right? Because the way the United States elects a president, and there's a lot of controversy over the Electoral College. Some people are arguing that we should abolish it. Again, these institutions were founded for a reason, okay? And that is the smaller states had to have assurances that they were going to be given fair treatment in comparison with their larger state partners, right? Especially when you go all the way back to something like the Three-Fifths Compromise, Virginia was going to have a massive amount of population, including its freed and slave populations. Again, there were travesties committed in the early days of America, especially in regards to slavery. And I think it's important that we understand that those were present, but I don't think that means we have to throw out the entirety of that section of American history. I think we can all recognize that that's a black eye, something that we wish we hadn't done. I think it's something that, we should talk about, but I don't think it's anything that disqualifies the entirety of our history. And I really appreciate the civil rights movement used the arguments of, what the founders wrote. You wrote that all men were created equal. And, it was talking about cashing in on that promissory note that you would treat us as equals. So I think it's, very important that we talk about that. But that's just a side tangent in regards to, Virginia having a massive population at the time, and New Jersey was a rather small state at the time. And so the smaller states, typically up north, needed assurances that they weren't just going to get railroaded, that is to say, only having one avenue option by the larger states. And so they came up with a system of the Electoral College, that is to say, your state votes, and your state gets a certain allotment of votes. And that certain allotment of votes is equal to the number of representatives you have in Congress. So the number of people that you have in the House of Representatives plus your 2 senators for each state. And so that's how the Electoral College is divided up. Recently, it's come under scrutiny, of course, because you have a situation where a president can win the popular vote but not win the Electoral College. But I want to point out something that's interesting here. People talk about it, but rarely does a president actually win majority of the popular vote. In fact, in 1992, Bill Clinton did not win a majority of the popular vote. He received a plurality of 43%, but not a majority, right? In fact, he went on to become president again when he ran in 1996. He also did not receive a majority at that election either. It was just a plurality. So, it could cause major problems if we go to a popular vote and require a majority. And then a retort for that would be, of course, well, what you could do is you could have the presidential election, and instead of requiring a majority, you could just require plurality. Okay?
Or you could have a runoff.
You could have a runoff. Oh man, runoff, that'd be a great idea. Except the problem is, if we do, say we end up doing a plurality, right? Someone with, literally 30% of the vote could win because, well, that's a plurality. And you have 10 party candidates running from 10 different parties. And it just ends up not being an effective system. So then, as Taz mentioned, you hear some people say, well, we have a runoff, right? Well, the problem with a runoff is you take the top 2 candidates. Imagine the top 2 candidates, say we have the pro this party, the pro that party. Say we end up, instead of having, a moderate right party, a moderate left party, ended up being the top 2 seats. Say now it's like a far right candidate and a moderate right candidate. Okay, now you're running a runoff situation. You only have those 2 options. Or even, the other side of the aisle, imagine it's a moderate left versus a far left, right? Or moderate versus moderate, etc. And so it creates this whole complex situation where you're having to literally pick the worse or better of two evils in a situation to try to get the vote. And so the Electoral College is a solution that allows us to have a definitive result regardless of the whim of the popular vote when it comes to dealing with a plurality or a majority or things like that, and only deal with the presidential election in a single election as compared to having to do it in multiple elections with runoffs and other situations.
Well, here's a thought. What if there was ranked choice voting at the national level?
I think ranked choice voting is a great idea. I really do. I think it's something that would require some either legislative or amendment changes to the Constitution. And I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I can't speak to that.
And just before we go further, the definition of ranked choice voting is you would look at a ballot that would have several options. So the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and however many other people were running at the national level. And instead of saying, I pick this one, it being a multiple choice situation, it would be a system of ranking where you'd say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. And ultimately, you would select the leader by seeing who got the most favor out of all of them. And that would allow, instead of having to choose between the lesser of two evils, maybe you could say that, oh, my preference is this third-party candidate, but if it has to be one of the two most popular at the time, then I can pick this one. And that would actually allow third-party candidates to gain more percentage of the vote than they currently do, where voting third-party is seen as a waste of your vote or as an opportunity to give the other candidate a chance to win the one that you definitely don't want to vote for.
Yeah. And I think ranked choice voting is a great idea to implement because, as you said, it would give people that option. And it's a very similar thing that happens in the caucus system, right? So we talk about, caucusing when it comes to Iowa in particular in the primaries, right? So you all come together and, you have, this quarter of the room, for instance, I'll talk about this year's candidates. We have Pete, over in this corner, and you have Bernie over in that corner, and you have, Biden in this corner, right? And if a candidate doesn't receive, critical mass, that is to say, if it doesn't receive a certain percentage in the first alignment, what it will do is allow, okay, Pete is out for this caucus, you can't have him. So now you need to shift over to one of the other camps that received that critical mass. And so ranked choice voting could do something similar, whereas to say, okay, say, you have your candidates, you have, Joe Jorgensen, who's your Libertarian candidate, you have Howie, who is the candidate for the Green Party this year. You could select either one of them as your first choice vote because you're saying, okay, both of the establishment candidates are trash. I don't want to vote for them in this cycle, so I'm going to vote third party. It will allow you to do first, but say you really hate one of the establishment candidates more than the other one. You could then put that person as your second choice. So if, the third party candidate doesn't receive that critical mass, it will allow you to shift to your second choice option. So it's a way to help open the avenue for third-party candidates. Again, as I just talked about the Electoral College kind of is designed to keep some third-party candidates at bay. I think that, if we really wanted to get rid of the Electoral College, we'd have to change the entirety of the American system because we would straight up go to almost a parliamentary or quasi-parliamentary system. Like they would have over in European countries such as Britain, right? And then you have, these multiple parties having to join together for a conglomeration to get a caucus to then be either in control of the Senate or whatever. And so it's not feasible. But I do think that right now where we're at, we have such polarized voices on both the right and the left that they're moving ever further right and ever further left. And these middle group of people really don't know where to go and don't have a good place. And so I think that opening up a choice like ranked choice voting would give those people a voice to say, okay, I'm not really digging what's going on here, and so I want to make that known, but I really, really don't like, X candidate compared to Y candidate. So I think ranked choice voting might be something that we can look at in the future, especially for our primary system. I think our primary system would benefit largely from that.
For sure, for sure. All right, well, starting off, even though it doesn't really affect the outcome of the election, I'm going to start out by reading you the results as they stand of the popular vote.
Okay.
Joe Biden, 50.5%. Donald Trump, 47.7%.
Okay, so no third-party candidate got 5% of the popular vote.
Correct. So our chosen candidate, Joe Jorgensen, did not really make the podium in this particular race.
And the reason why we're talking about that 5% is actually really important because the FEC, which is the Federal Election Committee, right? They are what give money to candidates for campaigning and things like that, and for parties, etc. And if a party were to receive 5% of the popular vote in a national election, they could then receive FEC funding. They were qualified for it. So if anyone ever tells you voting third party is throwing away your vote, okay? I voted in Texas. I can almost assuredly tell you, considering the fact that we just discussed that, Texas voted in John Cornyn, I can almost guarantee at this point that Texas did not turn blue, that Texas's electoral votes went to Donald Trump. And so I was fairly certain Texas was going to vote for Trump. So voting for Joe Jorgensen didn't really affect that. I knew Trump was going to win Texas, but it allows, the FEC funding, the possibility, I should say, for the FEC funding. But alas, that didn't happen.
Moving on to the Electoral College. We've alluded several times to the fact that we had our eyes on a couple of very specific states. One of those was Nevada, which Biden was leading in, but that was very, very close. Another was Georgia, which started out looking red, but slowly started to shift into the blue. Another was Pennsylvania, which Trump was initially doing quite well in, but as we know, they had that rule that allowed mail-in ballots to roll in until yesterday, regardless of their postmark. Another was Michigan, and finally, Arizona. The two main states that we were looking at, however, were Nevada and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, because it was so vital to Trump's re-election campaign, and for a long time he was winning by a point in there, and then slowly it started to shift towards the blue. Nevada, like I said, was going for Joe, and until yesterday, Joe was at 264 electoral college votes with the states that he had, and Nevada was worth 6 votes. So Trump had to win every single one of the states that I just mentioned in order to be at all successful, but Joe just had to keep holding on in Nevada. As of this morning, Pennsylvania and Nevada moved solidly for Joe Biden, and outlets like CNN and the Washington Post have called the election for Joe Biden with 279 electoral college votes, while Trump currently has 214 solidly for himself. That number will go up likely as some of these other states come in for him. But
do we know anything about what's going on in Florida?
Florida actually went for Trump.
Okay.
And it was called very early. Since 2000, when they had that whole hanging Chad thing, they've actually streamlined their election process and got it very efficiently done. And so on election night, we knew very clearly that Trump had.
What about Michigan?
Michigan broke for Biden 50.6% to 47.9%.
Okay. So I imagine there's going to be some litigation filed in Michigan.
Yep. And Pennsylvania.
Here's my thing about the Pennsylvania situation. I think it's utterly ridiculous that John Roberts, for some reason, trying to hold a shred of legitimacy or whatever, decided to not take up the case for Pennsylvania and then deal with it after the election. The fact of the matter is, you can't vote after election day, right? And so the fact that Pennsylvania was allowing mail-in ballots to arrive regardless of postmark up until November 6th is just utterly ridiculous. I think that if they were postmarked by the 3rd, they should be counted. And if they're not postmarked by the 3rd, personally, I think they should be just thrown out.
Now, I'm going to do a little bit of myth busting here. So, you mentioned earlier that you heard the rumor that 101% of registered voters were voting in Michigan. Michigan does have same-day voter registration.
Okay.
So, that is a pretty likely explanation for numbers like that.
Okay.
In Pennsylvania, they are sequestering votes that come in after Election Day. And the day after Election Day, 200 ballots showed up.
Okay. So
And that number has gone down since then, yes.
Yeah. So not an overly significant amount. Okay, that's fair. I still anticipate litigation to be happening in those states. But I think at the end of the day, I think we're going to see exactly what we saw in 2000. I think we're going to see litigation for litigation's sake. And it's not going to change anything unless we uncover massive, and I mean massive amount of voter fraud, which I highly doubt. Again, like we mentioned with Michigan, I didn't know how accurate it was. I heard it through some rumor mill without, really verified sources. And again, something like same-day registration could easily explain that. So I'm going to say that same-day registration is slightly problematic, but we're going to put a pin in that, and we're going to leave that there. But yeah, this this has been an interesting election. So right now we are at no clue what's going on in the Senate. We have some clue what's going on in the House, and we have kind of most of a clue what's going on in the presidency. That's what I'm gathering.
As we stand right now, we're most likely looking at going into January of 2021 with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. I'm gonna put it out there and guess that both of those Georgia Senate seats are probably going to go red. And if that happens, we'll probably be looking at the continuation of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
So right now it's 48-48. So there are a total of 2 seats left open, right? Or 4 seats left open. 4 seats left open. Bad math there, my apologies. So you have the 2 that are, of course, Georgia, where everyone has their eyes on. And I agree with your analysis. I think they will go red, especially after people see that Joe Biden has now won presidency, and the House is under Democratic control. I think, by and large, most people like a divided government. So I do agree with your analysis that both those seats will flip red. Also, I think in that one race where there were 2 Republicans running, I think those 2 Republicans are going to compound on top of each other and just completely overwhelm the Democratic candidate. So I agree. Either both red or one red, one blue. I don't see a scenario where they both go blue. But that being said, what are the other 2 that we're kind of sitting there going, I don't know what's going on there?
The other races are North Carolina and Alaska. So that would be Lisa Murkowski's race, and North Carolina is...
No, it's not Murkowski's race. It's Dan Sullivan.
Dan Sullivan.
But what's interesting is they only have 50% reporting right now, but Dan Sullivan has 60% of that vote. Okay, so Dan Sullivan's going to freaking win that. And then the other one was North Carolina. You have
Tom Tillis.
Tom Tillis. Okay, the problem here is, does North Carolina require a majority, or does it require plurality?
Not certain. It looks like he's got 48.7% of the vote right now, as opposed to 47, which Cal Cunningham has. If they go into a runoff, I imagine some of the people who voted for Libertarian Shannon Bray would probably break for him.
So, right now, we're kind of just waiting on those 4 results. I imagine Alaska will go Republican to give a 49th. I imagine at least one of the Georgia races will go Republican to give Republicans a total of 50. And then whatever happens in North Carolina, it's leaning red right now by 1.7%, so not a whole lot. And then, of course, the other race in Georgia, which is pretty close. So all in all, well, this has been an interesting 2020 election. It caps off an interesting year in 2020. So thank you for joining us for our election special. This is not something that we not going to be the format of our normal podcast. Again, if you're wanting to listen to that, you will likely go back to another episode and you'll see how we have it altered in those two alternating episode styles that we will be releasing. So if you've been joining us today, awesome. If you haven't, well, you should. And go ahead and give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts.
This has been Front Porch Report, the election special.